Welcome back to the Poor Proles Almanac. We're joined with Peter Gelderloos once again. And despite it being his third time on the show, he's back with a new book called They Will Beat the Memory Out of Us. The book reads as a reflection on decades of activism and the constant churning of new faces and voices, and how this impacts movement building. As an aged millennial, this book hits close to home and articulates many of my own feelings and experiences, and I think offers some really important questions we should be asking, as well as some potential answers. So please grab the book over at Pluto Press and take a listen. Peter, thanks so much for joining us. I think this is your third time on the show, which makes you the guest who has been on the most.
Oh, wow.
So that's pretty cool. I remember coming across your book, How Nonviolence Protects the State, when I was like 18 or 19. I was like, oh man, this guy's onto something. And it's cool to be able to chat with you about this stuff. And you just released this new book. So for folks that are not as familiar with you, could you just give us a quick background and what your new book is and kind of what it was about?
Yeah. So the new book, They Will Beat the Memory Out of Us, is about collective memory. It's about ruptures in continuity, the loss of intergenerational continuity in our struggles, about the loss of memory. Really, it's kind of like written from a place of like heartbreak with the movement, written from like a place of like a lot of pain and sadness. Just seeing like the longer that I've been in the struggle and the more that I've gotten to know people from the generations that came before us, or to read what they left behind, and in the case of those who've already died. It's just so sad to see how many times we've committed the same mistakes or similar mistakes, and to see some of these same things happening all over again, to see how much we pour into these struggles, how we can actually change things globally, change the direction that movements go in, or create stronger, smarter struggles just through our efforts, through our strategies, through our conversations. Like we can actually change that, and we can, set the world on fire. We can spread new concepts and practices that save lives. We can do all these things, and it's just so beautiful. And then it just falls away because we're exhausted or traumatized or in prison or sick or dead. And the people on the other side of it have, all these resources and all these monies, all the money, they can buy people off. So, folks who start off in the movement become politicians or tenured academics or, media figures and everything like that. And Leviathan is this very effective machine. It crushes down a part of us and buys off another part of us, and just keeps going, so that everyone is just kind of constantly forced to either just keep their heads down and survive the best they can, or to like dedicate all of their vital energies to renewing the very machine that's destroying the world.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah, as a elder activist at this point, I guess you could say, and I'll use that. I think the shelf life of being active is pretty short for most of us, at least, because to your point, we're all busy, we're all burnt out, and it does mean that it can be very easy for things to be lost over generations, right? And as I was reading this book, I was like, I felt like I was kind of reminiscing with an old friend about the way things used to be, because you tell these stories about, when I was younger, XYZ, or this anonymous person, discussed blah, blah, blah. And it was just like, oh yeah, that even if I wasn't there, I could sense that time and place in a way that was very nostalgic. And like looking back now at what I see as activism today just feels very strange and alienating in some ways. And despite like the great utility of social media and texting and all these things, it allows for cheaper communication in the sense of it's not as meaningful. And you kind of hint at that there's this strange dynamic that's kind of been developing in how organizing activism and kind of all these different pieces of how do we build a better world and how do we do this anonymously and protect our identities and continue to utilize the modern worlds that social media is a tool, whether or not we want it to be, and how does that integrate into how we engage with this kind of stuff? And I think that's really difficult for us to, I feel like I'm meandering, but I swear there is a point here. We think about like as millennials, we kind of look at like, oh, we're the in-between generation. We understand the world pre-technology and post-technology. But the older I get, the less I feel like I understand the world post-technology. And I think that that rapid shift is so difficult for us to translate those lived experiences to a new generation. I don't know if you have any thoughts about this.
Yeah. I mean, I guess first off, I think about myself kind of more as like inhabiting a like a middle place in terms of like, my age or my generation or whatnot. And I think it can be really, really useful and important to try to and like, there's the question of age, there's also the question of like how long people have been participating in, something that they understand as like the struggle or like the revolutionary movement. Lately I see like a lot of people who are like as old as I am or almost as old as I am or older than me who are, are just kind of like just starting. So I think it's for me it's been really useful to try to keep up strong connections with like people who are just starting, especially ones who are like, actually like, curious to learn stories of like other experiences, which is definitely not the same as like, getting told like, what's right and what's wrong and how you do
Mhm.
things. Cause, it's not like, we have a lot of experiences, but we don't know like, any kind of absolute truths. And also to do the really, really necessary work and just like, as, the acts of care of staying in touch with and taking care of the folks who came before us, the folks who have been in this longer than we have, and making sure that they don't just get like iced out and isolated by this way that capitalism really functions through like built-in forms of like ableism and kind of different generations that are very intentionally not supposed to connect with one another but are supposed to basically learn from the market, be nourished on all the cultural products of the market. But yeah, social media technologies and like constant internet technologies definitely accelerate that pace. They definitely like increase the alienation. Just because like without the tactile, without the olfactory, like relationships are weaker, memory is weaker. Like people, retain more from like a relationship, like experiences learned in a relationship. They retain more from a conversation, a little bit less, but they retain more from like a physical book that they hold in their hands. They retain even less from something that they read on a screen. And then now with like this in an age of like really really short text, like a timeline that's always constantly receding, like you're going to even like retain even less of that, and you have there's no relationship there, there's no real connection there. Yeah, like it's bad for everyone. Like it's literally makes people's memories worse, it makes people's relationships weaker. But it's going to be felt especially hard by folks who didn't grow up with that, who constantly like every few years have to like relearn entire new technologies or ways of interacting with the world. And yeah, it's an intentional feature of capitalism and how it maintains alienation as like a constant feature of our lives.
Yeah, and I think that becomes really obvious the more you, I guess, deal with younger folks, or at least people that are more engaged with the internet and utilize the internet as a means of parasocial relationships, because expectations, in my experience, are very different in terms of, I guess, the way people act and organize. And, I think about my own experiences a few years ago, without getting into too many details, as a young activist that I was working with was involved with something, and their first response was that after joining an existing organization was basically a list of call outs of problematic things that those people had done in terms of like if you want me to continue to be involved, these need to be addressed. And I think that speaks to this idea that you're talking about this memory, right? With folks that are older, their relationships to new language, new ideas on the left around what things like, and I guess intersectionality, how that fits into that old guard in a sense. And I use guard probably not in the right way, but in a sense of like you've got people that have put in time and effort and history, blood, sweat, and tears, quite literally in some cases. And then you have this really weird relationship with intersectionality. And you talk about this a bit in the book, where there are these college kids yelling at a friend for saying that they were not respecting Black leadership, despite also being a woman of color. And I think it does speak to like this weird, like, instead of seeing it as the relationship within the context of this greater complex system, it's seeing the complex system before the relationship. And I think that comes on the back of that atomization that exists because of the way that we engage with society, especially people that are more used to like an online formatting for like social dynamics.
Yeah. I mean, like I think it's that like the thing that you named about like how intersectionality comes up. I think it's definitely like a misunderstanding of intersectionality, which is at least in my interpretation is not meant to give people like, you know, a little cheat sheet scorecard that they can just like, you know, whip out and like instantly understand like everyone's ranking in the power
Yeah.
hierarchies on the planet. It's about every context, every moment changes like the different, you know, the like the different axes or flows of power that shape us, that shape the possibilities that we might have, that shape how we experience the situation. And so, you know, all of these things are very real, you know, race, gender, class, etc. But you know, too often they're getting reduced just to an abstract. They're being simplified in things that don't fit into an easy category or just getting ignored. As far as like, you know, what you were mentioning, like the story you mentioned about just talking about, you know, someone who's basically like all these demands about like, you know, things that had to change. Like I think on the one hand, like the people who spend most of their social time in virtual spaces, like you can just like leave the room at the virtual room. You can, you know, boot people out of it. You can just like block people. And like in like the real physical world, like that's a more complicated process. There's actually, you know, it's you actually have to put effort into it, you know, one way or the other. You know, you if you're not entirely just like getting all of, you know, not just your physical biological needs, but also your cultural and intellectual needs, you know, from the market and, you know, from like, you know, these little handheld devices, then like, you know, you actually depend on other people for your survival, for like important aspects of your life. And it becomes much clearer what's the difference between like discomfort and real harm. But I think it's also like, while we're, you know, we're shitting a lot on, you know, the Internet of Things, constant internet, social media, and all that. And that's important. But I think it's also really important to name our failures. I've been in very, 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 very extremely few radical spaces that have done a good job of dealing with conflict and that have done an even like partially adequate job of using some kind of transformative approach and non-punitive, non-carceral approach towards harm. And those are overlapping but different things. Like, you know, where there is harm, there's, you know, there's going to be conflict, and there's also like a lot of conflict that is not actually like, you know, scarring someone, traumatizing someone, or, you know, like, you know, threatening someone's life. And both of these things are real. And, you know, like I said, there's also a lot of major overlap, and there's definitely blurry spaces. And I don't really think there's like a need to draw like a clear line, like to have a clear definition between them. But we left this void open. We left this vacuum open by like so many of our movements just either intentionally refusing to do that work or just not being intentional enough about doing a good job of developing these practices. Like, people don't want to hear criticism. They'll still take criticism as an attack because like we're still running around with these huge egos, or people are afraid of discomfort, but they think that we're going to be able to like change the entire world and change like the most powerful oppressive structure in the history of the human species, like without discomfort. Like that doesn't make sense. People think that we're going to abolish the prison system, get rid of the police, and, you know, get rid of like punitive morality after centuries and centuries of these carceral systems and, you know, millennia of like punitive religious systems, without doing a whole lot of work to like, you know, train ourselves and teach ourselves to approach conflict, to approach harm, to approach healing and change in like a different way. And yeah, like in general, like we often have not known how to do that. Those of us who care about it have not known how to do it, or have done like really shitty job of it. And then just a whole lot of people who often have kind of more informal power in movement spaces will like sabotage that work or kind of manipulate it for their own ends, so that whatever tools we develop, will only be put in use if they, protect or extend the power of people who have more informal power in our scenes. So yeah, I think we need to have the criticism of technology, but it shouldn't be like self-serving where it helps us cover up our own role in like creating that gap that has been very easy for, this, kind of more virtual culture to fill.
Yeah, and I think it raises an interesting question of why that's been the case. From my own limited experience, I do feel like the reason why some of those things don't get addressed is because of the fact that it's difficult. There's no clear answer. I think there's a lot of reliance on like a scripture, so to speak, and there really isn't one that is clear and deals with the messiness of that discomfort and those struggles of good people doing shitty things, or miscommunications where, to your point, egos get involved. There's no real easy answer, especially I think given that these activist spaces are such small spaces as it is. I think about it like a complex system, right?
Yeah.
We frame everything within this, like, or at least the both of us, as far as I'm aware, kind of frame this within this ecological understanding of how humans organize, but we're not organizing at those scales, or those relationships don't exist at those scales where there is some flexibility in those activist spaces. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, in that way, it's reminiscent of the problem of anarchy itself. People in our society have been trained to feel safer with something where there's already a plan, there's already a blueprint in place, there's already an answer before you start the process. And that actually leads to much more harmful, much worse outcomes. And that's like another pattern, especially in the left, where people will trust methods and, ways of creating methods that have such a long historical track record of failure, of betrayal, of making things worse, but they give you an answer from the start. They promise you outcomes from the start. And with anarchy, the whole point is that we can take better care of ourselves if we treat it as a process, if we don't if we don't force society to adapt to a blueprint, if we don't need to like exercise control over the outcomes and just let ourselves engage with that messiness, because that messiness that's life, and also that's how we get meaningful experiences. That's how we become more intelligent and more skilled at these things. And also, we're not expecting some kind of end state that, we've implemented the solution and now it's over. And now we have to protect the solution and make sure, everyone follows it and so on and so forth. Like it's just a completely different way of approaching life. Yeah, people get fewer and fewer opportunities to approach life as a messy process, which is never over. It's always in flux. It's always continuing, and we all get to participate in that.
Yeah, I think people really like having a firm understanding of someone has figured this out. We just have to follow the rule book. I mean, you hear that a lot, especially on the state left of like the immortal science of XYZ, right? But my favorite, and as much as we've been talking shit about the internet, one of my favorite memes is like what would Karl Marx say if he were here today? And he's like, "You put a man on the moon." That jarring difference between what people think about and like how much society has evolved, where even if those texts were super useful in terms of organizing maybe 150 years ago, the world is just wildly different. And the idea that there's going to be a standardized framework that will apply no matter what economic, technological changes have come up is just like naive and forcefully in some cases. But I understand why people do get drawn to it.
And at the same time, there's patterns that I think have held pretty true, like, for the last couple centuries, which is like the left, like, these authoritarian parties, like, continue to approach revolution by offering, blueprints, or by, like, offering, their leadership, and they always end up either pacifying and sabotaging movements, or if they become like more effective and more powerful, like they just recreate capitalism, they just recreate the state. Now that we're dealing with an ecological crisis that has the very real possibility of leading to the extinction of our whole species, along with millions of other species, and at the very least is already right now killing tens of millions of people every single year, and is only going to get worse. A lot of like the proposed solutions, like more green energy, are just refusing to actually engage with what's happening, with what the causes are, what the roots are, like where it's coming from. And it's just like the surviving countries that resulted from socialist revolutions in the 20th century, like they're not acting any differently. They're still growth-based economies. They're still authoritarian states protecting those economies. And yeah, so it's just it definitely provides, maybe like what you were getting at, it provides like a very new lens to look at the problem from. But some of these problems have been around a really long time, and they just keep coming back. And that's one of the things that's just kind of so depressing, is like, like instead of like just trusting themselves, trusting ourselves, trusting like these expanding collective communal networks to be resilient the way that they've proven themselves so many times, resilient and intelligent, like with every hurricane, every wildfire, every catastrophe, like people who don't even have any experience in these movements that are building mutual aid and that are, like trying to organize in solidaristic, mutual, collective ways, just like people completely outside of that, are suddenly acting like, way more effectively, way more solidaristically, and way more intelligently than government bureaucracies or NGOs are. But then, like, when it comes to like a moment to like intentionally think about like, how to go about dealing with these problems, they, once again put their trust in like these old, expired leftist models that have such a long history, such a clear track record, and none of it is good.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. And I find myself, the older I get, agreeing with Margaret Killjoy's commentary. I can't remember the term she uses exactly, the bottom left or something like that, about like libertarian. We have more in common as anarchists with the libertarian right than the state left or the totalitarian left. And I do find that to be particularly useful. I mean, you see that kind of playing out in real time right now with what's going on in Ukraine and Palestine and Syria now. You can navigate how people feel politically within those three sections, and you'll find that there's a lot more overlap with the libertarian side than the left side in terms of, the autonomy and rights of the citizens of those places.
I would push back on that interpretation. Um, so I think it's really, this is a place where it's really important to, I think, remember the history of those words. Right and left refer to different aisles of Congress or the parliamentary building. It's like, terminology that arose in one of the French revolutions of the 1800s. So right and left are both state-oriented terms, and in most other languages, they continue to use them in that way. English, for whatever reason, has been particularly bad at like keeping the history of its words.
Sure.
Also, libertarian arose as like a direct synonym for anarchism. When like during a period of censorship in France, like a publication would get shut down if it used the word anarchist. And then some like right winger, like free market, is so-called free market ideologues, very like mostly in the English and German speaking spheres, very intentionally in like the early mid 20th century, decided to steal some vocabulary from revolutionary movements. And in English, people gave up that fight and they just like let them have the term libertarian, which was never theirs. In most other languages, that didn't happen. And you'll see like these same gross right-wing tech bros try to do the same with anarchists, with the word anarchism.
Yeah.
And that's definitely not a fight that we should concede. There was this dumb documentary a while ago that like supposedly about anarchism. It was just about these like dumb, wretched right-wing tech bros. I think we benefit when like the real divisions are not between phrase from like Cold War Germany, like not between East and West, but between above and below.
Yeah.
But we could say, like, if it, the big dividing line is not between, left and right, which is ultimately politically oriented, we're talking about political parties, or if, it's at the most extreme end, revolutionary organizations that are still oriented towards the state because they want to capture the state, and they're either naive or cynical enough to claim that they will, use the state as an instrument for good, which is obviously absurd. But so, like, the real dividing line, we're best off when the real dividing line isn't between left and right, but between above and below. We saw that a little bit between, like, how different people, based on how much power they had, largely how they responded to the killing of that health insurance CEO. But just as, like, we need to be critical of people who orient themselves towards the state as though it were a tool that could help us, we need to, always be extremely critical of people who orient themselves towards whiteness, towards patriarchy, towards all of these other values that the left protects, but the right wing openly champions. And so, like, another old mistake that would be extremely tragic to fall into would be to, like, erase, these very real differences between how, like, most people at the grassroots of, like, left-wing movements versus, like, right-wing movements, like, their approach to questions like, gender and migration and race, colonialism and things like that. I think there are many, many, many more sincere people that we can work with who identify with the left, and very few who identify with the right, just because of how the right primarily mobilizes, not through any pretend concern for the environment or for justice and fairness and freedom, or for supposed concern over racism or genocide or anything like that. Like, we saw it in this last election. Like, they were mobilizing pretty much 100% on the basis of transphobia and xenophobia.
My thought, I guess, is more along the lines of, if we think about it as potential from a typical, say, Marxist with, a thorough education, comprehensive reading list, yada yada yada. If that is where they've ended up, I find that they tend to not shift as much. Whereas I would definitely believe that a majority of people who self-identify as libertarian, meaning right wing, would instead have very little education when it comes to navigating all of the stuff that, this is like intersectionality. And I find in my own experiences talking with many folks in that space, they're much more amenable to, with the exception of obvious, usually religiously based right wing spaces, that they tend to be much more considerate and open to some of those ideas. But the challenge usually, in my experience, is that they read stuff like intersectionality as based on state power, which they're inherently against, and that everything will, come out in the wash, which obviously it won't. But I find that as an easier starting point to radicalize somebody than somebody who's already been radicalized to, like, a Marxist perspective, and then trying to reel that back in, which, again, I think that is an entirely subjective experience based on folks that you've worked with, that I've worked with. And I'm sure the answer is probably someplace in the middle. But I do think that there's good.
Yeah, no. I think like what you're saying is valid. Like, if we have an opportunity, so, like, I don't, it sounds like neither of us are talking about, like, spending our time, like, in dialogue with, like, rich people with, like, a lot of media power or anything like that. But if we have an opportunity to talk to, like, regular folks who are, sort of, like, swept up or find something compelling in these right-wing narratives, whether they're family members or neighbors or, coworkers or something like that. If we have the opportunity to talk to them, yeah, I definitely can think of, like, plenty of cases when, like, at the very least, they maybe don't actually know any trans people or queer people, and, like, everything that they're getting is, like, coming from the right-wing media. At the very least, a lot of times, like, you can get folks to realize that they're actually wishing harm and creating a very dangerous environment for, like, other folks who are, like, just people like them. And, like, I think that's, like, definitely useful work. And, like, sometimes, like, they can even you can even, like, show people the ways that their whatever political organizations or the ideologies that they're following are not going to, address any of the, in the case where there are like, real issues. So yeah, real issues, for example, around like, economic exploitation or political corruption that they're responding to, like, yeah, if you can like help folks see that they're on a path that's just making things worse, and that they're like, actually like supporting folks who actually like want to like, line up and kill folks just because of their gender or race, then that's definitely, if you have the capacity to do that, it's a conversation worth having.
Yeah. But I think all this, to kind of navigate back to the book, ties into this idea of memory, right? Of how we organize, how we, without me or you talking to somebody and trying to engage them about these ideas. And sometimes it does feel like there may not be a greater framework for having these conversations, that there's just no living memory of these, of trying to, it feels like we're doing some of this stuff for the first time when that's not the case, because that memory has been destroyed, sometimes purposefully, sometimes just due to the clandestine nature of activism and organizing, and that we really need to like build these stories to help frame up how we're doing things today, to recognize the past, the pros and cons of that past, the struggles, successes and failures, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's really important. I remember I was reading this news article or something. I think it was a journal of someone describing their first time going to meet with some indigenous elders, and this really long beginning to the conversation where before they talked about anything, they went through like the history of that person's ancestry and
Mm.
their stories, and he explained that the reason they do that is so that they never forget them. It can seem a little silly at first, but also like if we're talking about losing memory, that is the best way to keep memory alive, is to make that memory a part of tradition, to make that memory a part of day-to-day living, to remind yourself that these are not just things that you read in a book and put on the shelf and then you maybe remember it here and there, but these active living things that influence the day-to-day decisions that we make.
Yeah, always creating room for our stories.
Exactly, and allowing new stories to become born. And you talk about, and this is a quote from the book, no one dies but those who are forgotten. We all exist through our relations. How can we keep these relationships and memories alive through all the turbulence and repression, scarcity, and of life itself? And one of the examples you talk about is dealing with someone that's been imprisoned, and how when that happens, a shift in those relationships changes, and a lot of that weight to keep those memories alive fall on romantic partners and family, and that's not enough. I mean, that's that's too much to put on individual people, and that's something from my own personal experiences I've dealt with when someone was imprisoned, and like a good friend, and while he was in prison, dealing with like I don't even know what to do, what to say, how do I engage with you while I'm living my life and you're kind of stuck in this moment in history? It feels a little bit from the outsider's perspective as living on an island, but that's where community is the most important, when it's the most difficult.
Yeah, yeah.
What are your thoughts about how do we start to bridge this in a material way?
Specifically with folks who are locked up, I think it's really important to hold a space for them in our day-to-day lives. Like if we have a protest or some kind of neighborhood event, to name folks who are like from that neighborhood, or parts of our families or friends or something like that who are locked up, just to name them so people are like not forgetting about them. If we're doing some kind of event or a meal or a social center, like we can set a place for them and name it. It's really important to make sure that they're getting money in their commissary funds, because like folks do not get everything that they need to survive for free in prison. Sending them letters. Yeah, like you would mention this to me, and I've definitely heard it from other people, that like folks are really unsure about like how to write to prisoners, what to write. They're worried about like talking about good things. Write it, send it. Like those, like being able to like hear from the people that you care about, and being able to like know what's going on in the outside world, that helps take you momentarily out of prison. It's not going to be true for everyone. There are going to be like some people who like like when I was on the inside, like folks who were doing like much longer sentences, would generally say that they loved getting visits, like they loved seeing people, but also like getting visits from folks on the outside like makes the time go slower. And so some people would actually prefer not to get visits like that. So that's like, that's going to be like different person to person. That's also something that like folks who are locked up are perfectly capable of communicating, but like with like a, like a letter, like a, like they can just like choose like not to open it. Like, yeah, people should just write about their lives, like definitely send commissary funds, send books, continue to remember them, name them, and keep a place for them, here on the outside. Definitely think and plan around like release, reentry. Folks who have, been like even just like a few years in prison and definitely longer, like reentry is often harder than being on the inside. And that's often when people get completely forgotten, that they don't get support, they don't get help, like catching up to where the movement is at now, where the culture is at now. And they really need that support. They need, the opportunity to be able to share their stories. They need the opportunity to be like silent, but just like accompanied. They need help navigating, like, finding jobs, healthcare, stuff like that. They need, the patience and the grace to make mistakes. They need resources and time for healing. So that's definitely something that, we do a decent job with prisoner support, but I think on the whole, we barely, do anything for helping people get out.
Yeah. And I think a lot of those things translate into how do you build a better community, right? Making space for people to be imperfect, I think, is one of the biggest roadblocks that in my experience, is that I feel like we see, and to your point that you'd made earlier about like dealing with disagreement and dealing with, is this an actual traumatic or dangerous situation, or are people just being shitty and doing dumb stuff? That can be really difficult, and making space for people to do shitty things and give them time and space to acknowledge and realize that, and recognizing that doing something bad doesn't make you a bad person, because we all make mistakes and do bad things, as long, and understanding how to navigate that and create that real glue that holds people together even when it's not comfortable. And I'm going to take one more quote from you where you talk about this a little bit. You say, "We don't agree on many things. We'll never all be friends, and that's okay. We'll still try to have each other's backs." And I think that is the core part. That if that starts to crumble, we're in deep trouble.
Yeah, and then that requires so many things. Like it requires all of us to be like a lot more reflective and self-critical, to like welcome criticism as a gift, even and especially if it's coming with anger. To have like much better resources resources that don't just show up in a moment, but resources that last for people who have been hurt. Like it can take a whole lifetime, like healing from some of these things, like being learning more about trauma and how it works, learning more about some of the most common ways that people I like either might have been hurt growing up in their families or wherever, or how people might be hurt by their partners or by their friends, or in our movements. And making sure that those folks get taken care of, and also like making sure it's also like really easy, like if someone like gets caught like doing something bad, like to kind of scapegoat them as a way for like the larger crowd of people who have maybe often done similar harmful things, to kind of like escape any of that accountability by like just acting like there's like a couple bad guys out there, and then neutral people and victims were like, when we all have a lot of learning like to do, like we learning how to heal, learning how to support one another, learning how to give criticism or say hard things, learning how to receive those things.
Yeah, and I think also one thing that I think is particularly important, I don't think you talk about it explicitly, but I think you imply it, is that this type of work of trying to build memory, to build more resilient communities effectively, because memory is contingent on there being a community of people to pass that memory down to, is inherently a multi-generational thing. Our job isn't to fix it or solve it. It's just simply to make it better, make things better than when we showed up. And that's all we can really hope to do. We, aim aim to make things perfect, but understand that all our job really is to make things better, easier, and provide, at the very least, examples of what doesn't work, and to make sure those examples get passed down.
And then yeah, finding the people to pass that on to,
Yeah.
for sure.
So, Peter, your book is called They Will Beat the Memory Out of Us. Where can people buy it if they want to read more of your work, all that good stuff? Where can people find you?
Folks can not order it from Amazon, but go to their local bookstore, see if their local bookstore wants to carry it. They can ask their local library to order a copy, so it'll be free for anyone who wants it. They can probably pirate a PDF for free off the internet. They could order it from the publisher's Pluto Press. Sometimes it can be a bit easier to get it through I think like the AK Press website in the US for US distribution, but otherwise straight from Pluto Press at book fairs. Hit me up and ask me for a copy.
Cool. Social media, and you're not on Instagram, but you're on Blue Sky, right?
Blue Sky and the hellscape that is Twitter or whatever. But I'm not so present or responsive on those, but I'll occasionally post links or whatever to articles and stuff. Yeah, it's just my name, Peter Gelderloos, on either of those. I also have a newsletter for with a couple essays or stuff like that. Sometimes just rants, and other times more crafted essays. A couple a month, and that's just my name, petergelderloos.substack.com.
Yep. And if you need the link and you follow us on Substack, I do have him as a recommended read. So if you can't remember to type that in, you can just go find it there. Peter, thanks so much. This has been fantastic. It was a great read. I highly recommend it to anyone who feels kind of like something is missing in movements. This is going to scratch that itch for you to feel like you're not alone in trying to figure out what's going on and what we need to do to change things. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for your podcast and your writing. Definitely, folks should check out your newsletter as well.
Yeah, thank you.